Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss Shiloh, 1862. The book discusses the Civil War in general and the Battle of Shiloh in particular. Its author is Winston Groom, acknowledged widely to be one of America's finest writers. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and he is the author of the famous book and movie Forrest Gump. Joining me today to discuss his work is Winston Groom. Usually, as you know, my guest joins me in the studio at the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover, Massachusetts. But because of scheduling difficulties for this interview, it's being conducted long distance, with Mr. Groom in Alabama and me in Andover. And I am, of course, the regular host of Books of Our Time, Dean Lawrence R. Velvel of the Massachusetts School of Law. Winston, thank you very much for being with us. Glad you are sitting for this interview.
Yes.
And let me begin by quoting, you called it the epigraph, I think. You find this in a lot of books, but rarely have I read one as striking as the one you've put in the front of your book. I'm going to read it. It's just 4 lines. For Romans in Rome's quarrel spared neither land nor gold, nor son nor wife, nor limb nor life, in the brave old days of old. And that's from Macaulay on the Roman Civil Wars. Maybe you could explain the relationship of that quote to the American Civil War, and perhaps to the Battle of Shiloh in particular.
Well, I think it's generally acknowledged that civil wars are the most terrible of wars, because you do pit brother against brother, friend against friend, and for some reason the animosity, I don't know why that is, but the animosity in civil wars becomes quite terrible. It certainly did in the American Civil War. And of course at Shiloh, it was one of the battles that did in fact pit brother against brother, because you had many regiments from Kentucky and from Missouri who were both regiments in the Confederate Army and regiments in the Union Army. And there's just something particularly satanic almost about fighting your own kind, about eating your own dead, so to speak.
When Macaulay speaks here, sparing neither land nor gold, nor son nor wife, nor limb nor life, Shiloh, as I understand it, was the first time that Grant and Sherman understood that that's what this war was going to be like.
Yeah, I think that it certainly instructed them that, because before Shiloh, I think everyone, just about everybody, assumed that there was going to be one great battle and that was going to end the war. And whether it was in the East or the West or both, and the events in the East and Shiloh in the West certainly demonstrated that this was not going to be so, that there were going to be many, many battles like Shiloh, and Shiloh was quite terrible. It was an enormous shock on the American public on both sides.
Yep. Shiloh was April 6th, if I remember, of 1862.
Yes.
And Antietam, which was just as bad and had certain geographical similarities on the battlefield, there were some major differences, was September 17th, May, June, July, August, 5 months later, 5 months and 10 days later. And these two battles were both of them were unlike anything Americans had ever seen in terms of casualties and just sheer horrificness.
Well, before Shiloh, the only major battle in the Civil War had been the Battle of First Bull Run or Manassas. And there were, I think, 4,500 casualties. And that was terrible to the American people on both sides. When it comes along Shiloh, there were 24,000 casualties. And people were horrified. They couldn't imagine that many, and especially when you consider the relative population at that time. It would probably today translated, I'm just making a guess, into 200,000 casualties or more.
Right.
In one fight.
Right. Something like the Battle of the Bulge, perhaps. You mentioned Manassas, you know. Here's a little known fact that should go into Ripley's Believe It or Not. The only battle in the Civil War named after a Jewish person is the Battle of Manassas. The guy owned a tavern or something there.
You know, one time I was in Washington, I was a journalist there, but I was been asked to be on a panel at the University of Virginia along with Willie Morris, who was my late great friend. And so I drove him down there. We were on with Arthur Ashe, a great tennis player. I've forgotten why we were there, but anyway, I was driving down. Willie was a great fan of the Civil War history, and I was driving on the interstate, and I said, Willie, or here's Manassas, there's a big sign that says Manassas. He said, well, was that first Manassas or second Manassas?
There are 4 protagonists at Shiloh to whom you pay a great deal of attention. Of course, there were many protagonists, but you pay a lot of attention to Grant and Sherman and Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed at Shiloh, and Beauregard, who was Johnston's second in command and took over after Johnston was killed. Maybe you could just briefly go through the life and military histories and the views of each of these 4 people, starting with Ulysses Simpson Grant.
Well, there have been many books written about each one of them.
Yes, indeed.
But
surprisingly few
Grant,
about Sherman.
That's true. He was the most fascinating of all those characters, I think.
Yeah.
But Grant, he was a most unlikely candidate to be ultimately the commander-in-chief of the Union Army and President of the United States, for that matter. I mean, when they sent him to West Point, the people of his town said they were embarrassed that they had sent such a creature. He was essentially an indifferent student. He was at the bottom of his class, not the total bottom, but he was down there. And he did, in fact, perform very well in the Mexican War, but he was a quartermaster. They wouldn't give him top infantry or cavalry jobs, but he was very brave. And then he, of course, continued in the Army, and he wound up out in California drinking a lot, and it got him in trouble, and he essentially had to resign from the Army, and then he sort of bumbled along on a series of jobs, real estate salesman and failed farmer, and he wound up working for his father in a leather goods store in Ohio. And when the war broke out, he could not seem to get a commission in the regular Army, but the governor of the state gave him a commission to train recruits, and he did it so well that they gave him more recruits until finally he had what constituted a brigade, and that required a brigadier general. And suddenly Grant is a general. Now, general, once you reach the rank of general, you're up in the stellar group of commanders. It's quite different from jump from colonel to general. And the generals have essentially the commands of their own. I mean, they do what they want to do within reason. And Grant clearly saw, whereas some of the other Union commanders did not see, that an offensive, forceful move out of the Cairo, Illinois, which was the sort of jumping off point, down some way down the Mississippi River Valley, either the Mississippi River or the Tennessee River, one of those rivers. Grant was determined that he was going to have an amphibious operation, and this was almost unheard of. But he got along well with the Navy, and they had the transport to take his army, hundreds of the vessels, and they had ironclad boats to protect them. Sherman was brilliant. I read his writings and I marvel at them. He's sort of like Lindbergh. He really has a gift for gab, or a gift for writing, and he's a very smart guy. He's intellectual, but he was essentially, he didn't show it. But I mean, he was gruff. He wasn't a pretentious intellectual. Sherman, he married well, but he too got out of the Army because he couldn't make a living in it. Wound up, he was a president of a bank. That failed, and then he was a president of a streetcar company. But when the war came along, he immediately was made a colonel in the regular Army, and he fought at Manassas, first Manassas, and wound up, unfortunately, making a statement that got him in a lot of trouble. The Secretary of War was visiting his command in Kentucky, and Secretary of War asked him, how many people do you think it will take to subdue this rebellion in the Mississippi River Valley? And Sherman told him he thought it would take 250,000 men. And there weren't 250,000 men in the entire army at that point. And this news got back through the Secretary of War to the newspapers, having the Secretary of War suggested that this was a crazy idea, and the newspapers seized on that and said Sherman was crazy and that he was insane and so on. And it literally drove him from his command, and he wound up getting his command back as a quartermaster, essentially what Grant used to be. But he was so good that Grant, they functioned very well together, and Grant then made him his second in command at Shiloh. We go to Sidney Johnson, Albert Sidney Johnson. He was sort of the model of the American soldier. He was a tall, striking, handsome man with a big handlebar mustache. Very good record at West Point, good record in the Mexican War. He was destined probably to command the Army, he and Lee, or Lee, somewhere. But when the war came along, he was a man, he was from Kentucky, and he then living in, or he made his home in Texas. He was in California on an assignment, but he went with the South. People expected great things of him. Jefferson Davis did. I think Sidney Johnson perhaps was not as wise a commander as everybody thought. He was a doggone good division commander. Whether or not he could command an army, the question became moot because he was killed. And his job was taken over by Beauregard, who talked a good game but turned out to be overly cautious. And as a result, he backed away from what many people thought could have been a victory at Shiloh. And he still gets a certain amount of disregard in the South because of that.
He had made his name as the man in charge of bombarding Fort Sumter.
Yes, well, also at First Manassas.
And at First Manassas, yes.
Also at Battle of Bull Run. He was one of the two, he and Johnson were the two generals there, and Beauregard was credited actually with the victory at Manassas.
Right. That was Joseph Johnston, and then Beauregard was second in command under Albert Sidney Johnston, who, as you say, was Jefferson Davis's beau ideal of a soldier.
But Beauregard had made a pest of himself there in Richmond after the war, and he'd gotten on Jefferson Davis's bad side, and it has been suggested that he was sent west to get him out. He was a burr under Davis's saddle. He was writing letters to the newspaper and things like that. And he was ejected from Richmond and sent west to annoy Johnson.
It always has fascinated me, Winston, that I know of no other war, probably my ignorance, in which generals and other high officers felt free to disregard orders and or to say that the people above them were out of their minds. You just don't get that very much today, and I don't know any other war where you did.
I mean, there was some of that in World War I that I remember, in particular in the British Army, because it was so tragically bogged down in Flanders and on the Western Front. But these generals they wouldn't do it publicly. Oh no, I mean you'd be court-martialed if you did that publicly. But there was a lot of sniping.
It's pretty much open in the Civil War. People knew about it, as I understand it. And certainly there's been a lot of writing about it. You talk in the book, you explain the antagonisms and how they manifested themselves between North and South in the 1840s and 1850s. Maybe you could go through that a little bit, since that seems to me to be a period of history that our history courses seem to ignore rather considerably.
It's an extremely complex time in American history, I think. There was slavery in all of the colonies, I think, except Massachusetts. There may have been slavery there in the beginning. After the Revolution, the states, many of the northern states began to abolish slavery. It was not abolished in the South. It was on the way out in the South, I think, because it was uneconomical. but all of a sudden came along cotton. And cotton was extremely labor intensive. And essentially, you couldn't have planted cotton without slaves. There were no tractors, of course. And cotton was so huge, it became so huge so quickly. You have to remember that by 1859, 1860, cotton accounted for 80% of all the trade revenues of the United States. It was enormous, and it wasn't just a few planters who were wealthy. Everybody was getting rich on cotton. The guy that ran the steamboat, the lawyers, doctors, the druggist, the guy who owned a warehouse, all of these people, the entire South was driven by cotton. I think many people in the South knew that they essentially were riding on the back of the tiger with slavery, but they didn't know what to do about it. And the abolitionists came along beginning in the 1820s from New England, and they essentially preached that slavery was an inefficient thing and it should be abolished. But then after 4 or 5 years, they began to preach that it was a moral wrong, and so there was a lot of name calling, and the name calling was not one-sided; it went back and forth. I mean, people wrote pamphlets in those days, and you also have to understand that people back then, they didn't go around calling names like they do today, because somebody would challenge you to a duel or something. They were still, and you had to be rather careful, and people were shocked by this and astonished, and it escalated and escalated, the war of the newspapers. And then, of course, the telegraph came along, where you got instantaneous news all of a sudden. And this, by the time the eve of the Civil War, everybody was so angry that it almost, I mean, there was a true hatred between the North and the South. As a matter of fact, there was a theory that was rather popular, actually. I think Jefferson Davis subscribed to it, and Admiral Semmes and some of the Southerners, that what they call the Yankees were an entirely different race of people from them, that they had been descended from the Roundheads of Cromwell in England, and had disturbed the peace in England by murdering King Charles, and then they disturbed the peace of Holland when they went there, and they came back and went to New England. They were humorless, and they were money grubbing and so forth. This was the theory, as opposed to the Southerners, this theory went, who were descendants of the glorious the Restoration. And they landed at Jamestown in Virginia, and there was some truth in that my ancestors landed in Jamestown. They then migrated to North Carolina, and then from North Carolina, when slavery came in, they migrated to the interior states, Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. That's sort of a brief history of it, the rancor between the states that almost by 1860 could have been solved by nothing else but war.
Point out that what they call Southern yeomen, the small farmers, they had been trained to think that the Northerners were their enemies and evil, and so they fought like banshees in the Confederate armies, even though they didn't own slaves, and to a significant extent didn't have that much at stake. Although, as you point out, the entire Southern economy was pitched around the plantation, so they had something at stake.
Well, they did. I mean, even the small farmers, they could grow a bale of cotton and make several $100s, which was worth a lot of money in those days. But they had been raised to think of Yankees as their enemy, and when the Northern armies began to invade, they thought of this as an invading army, very much like France would have thought of the Germans as an invading army. I think Shelby Foote used to love to tell a story about a Union colonel who was questioning a Confederate private after having captured him, and he asked him why you Southerners were fighting. Why are you fighting us? He said, fighting you because you're here.
You know, a story that I had no idea about before I read it in your book revolves around the fact that a senator from Ohio named Benjamin Wade, who was a famous, or some would say infamous and notorious abolitionist, and along with Charles Sumner, was one of the people in the Senate who used to castigate mercilessly, verbally, you know, the southern people and the slaveholders and so on, that nobody would challenge him. They would challenge other people, but nobody would challenge him to a duel. And the South had what was called the co-duello, if I remember correctly.
That's it.
And nobody would challenge him because he was a crack rifle shot. And they knew if they challenged him, he had the choice of weapons, and he would choose a rifle. And that's it. You know, that's all she wrote.
Yeah, he was a baiter. He baited the Southern fire eaters, and called them all sorts of names, and dared them to challenge him.
So you did get all these political attempts at compromise. They all failed. The hatred grew. And there are those who say that the politicians are fundamentally responsible for the war because instead of trying to compromise, they acted as they acted. Do you have an opinion on that?
When Lincoln was elected, the problem was that the South didn't believe him. He said, I don't want to disturb slavery in the southern states where it exists. He said, I do want to limit it from expansion. But the Southerners didn't believe him, and one of the reasons they didn't believe him was because of all this abolitionist literature that was coming out of the Republican Party. And the literature coming out of the Republican Party didn't square with what Lincoln promised. And they thought that Lincoln was basically an abolitionist and he was going to take their slaves. Of course, some of these Southerners had a tremendous amount of capital tied up in slaves. Lincoln actually had suggested that the government purchase the slaves, but nobody paid any attention to that either. It had just gotten so far that everything seemed to be exaggerated. And the South finally had just made its decision when Lincoln was elected. South Carolina was the first state to secede, and then the deep South states, and then when Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the rebellion, the Virginia and the Tennessee and the northern southern states began to secede. And it was sort of too late to stop it. I think the politicians might have stopped it somehow. But Lincoln was determined, you know, the South sent a delegation to Lincoln to try to make it a peaceful separation. And Lincoln wouldn't see them because he was going to brook no separation.
Southern planters, as you were indicating, had so much money tied up in slaves that you know, they were among the wealthiest people. In fact, I think they were the wealthiest people in the United States. Pierce Butler of South Carolina and Wade Hampton and Wade Hampton's family, these were immensely wealthy people back in those days, were they not?
Oh, sure they were. Well, of course, because in the North you had, especially in New England, you had these industrialists, and they were quite wealthy as well. But Wade Hampton, you know, had, I forget, what, 10,000 slaves or something. It was an enormous number.
You know, up until the time of Shiloh, what was the state of war and the thinking about military strategy, including Albert Sidney Johnston's line in Kentucky to the Mississippi River?
Lincoln was very, very distressed at the way the war was progressing, both in the East and the West. In the West in particular, he wanted somebody to do something, and Halleck wouldn't do it. He was extremely cautious, and he saw 10 Confederates behind every tree. Lincoln kept prodding him, and he got nowhere. Then Grant, more or less on his own, went down the river, and he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, respectively, and that opened up an enormous highway into the South by river navigation, where you could put 300 troops on each troop transport. You had 100 troop transports or more, and steam down these rivers and land them anywhere you want into the heart of the South. So that was a great encouragement right on the eve of the battle. And Grant had assembled after Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. He pushed further south and was intending to destroy Albert Sidney Johnston's army, which had, after the Battle of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, had moved all the way back from the Kentucky border to the Tennessee, the lower Tennessee border, moved the line of battle, and they had assembled at Corinth, Mississippi, which is about, I believe, 20 miles roughly from Shiloh. Shiloh was selected all but by accident. Sherman had been sent down there to destroy the railroad, the Southern Railroad, because to keep them from moving troops back and forth from the east to the west. He accomplished virtually none of that because the river rose up on him and almost got drowned. And so they didn't know what to do, so they went back and they found this plateau that was called Pittsburgh Landing. It was a hog and cotton landing with a very poor area there, maybe 12 square miles. And it was bounded by the river on one side and swamp on the other side. It's sort of a cornucopia, I describe it, or more or less of a triangle. And but it had fresh water, and it had some areas that were suitable for army encampment. So Grant began to assemble his army there. Sherman was sort of the man on the spot. Grant had his headquarters back about 9 miles from there, a little town called Savannah. There was a Union sympathizer there, and Mr. Cherry, and he had a mansion and right there on the water. And so Grant establishes, for some reason, I don't know why he wasn't with his men, that he had better control from there or something, or maybe just more comfortable for him.
I've always sort of suspected the latter. Living in this guy's mansion beat camping out on Pittsburgh Landing. Is the land around Shiloh, Winston, anything like the land around Vicksburg in the sense of the ravines and the cut-up nature of it and all that? It's a junior Vicksburg. It's not as bad as Vicksburg. Vicksburg, I think one old soldier described it, he said, when God had gotten through making the earth, he had a lot of old scraps left over, and he threw them down on Vicksburg. Because Vicksburg is just one big ravine after the other. That river has carved out so much around there over the eons. Shiloh was not the same kind of terrain, but the excavations weren't as deep, but they were there. And it was heavily wooded and broken by farm fields of sort of a handful of farmers, settlers in there. And I think that there were probably some fields that were created by these giant tornadoes that blow through there every so often. So but essentially it was a wooded area cut up by streams and some ravines and broken by these farm fields. It made it really, it was better, much better for defense than it was for an attack. I have seen the land around Vicksburg, and to somebody who's never seen anything like that, this is just staggering. So Shiloh is kind of a minor league Vicksburg. I can understand, a little better having seen Vicksburg, what it might be like. To go back for just a moment, you were talking about Grant's use of the rivers to go south. And you pointed out in the book that the Union Navy, which built all kinds of what were called timber clads and then tin clads and finally the iron clads, that it used to go down those rivers and bombard bridges and bombard the shore and so forth. It struck me that in Grant's conception, those rivers were very much like the way we regard interstate highways today, or the way the Germans regarded their autobahns. Hitler regarded the autobahns in the 1930s as routes for moving people back and forth, from one front to another. In this case, it was, in the case of the Civil War, it was a route to go south.
Well, in those days, you really had two modern means of transportation. One was railroad, and the other was a steamboat. And other than that, you had to fight it through with wagons, and that was, to move an army that way took a long time. But you could move an army overnight by steamboat. A steamboat, could go around the clock. It could go 200 miles a day if it's got the water. These big ironclads were virtually indestructible. They were huge boats. They fished one out of the river down there by Vicksburg and made it into redid it, and it's in the park there. And if you look at it, it's a monstrous thing, 170 feet long, and there were virtually no cannons that the South had that could. Well, they did have a few at Fort Donelson, but it didn't have enough to stop these things. They could go all the way all over the South and blow everything to bits if they wanted to.
Shiloh itself today, I gather from what you said, is pretty much in pristine form. It's as it was 150 years ago, as opposed to, say, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and even Gettysburg for that matter. But I gather that Pittsburgh Landing today, Shiloh today, is still way out in the boonies, and there's not been much development around it.
Shiloh is one of the, I think, finest preserved of all the Civil War battlefields. That and Vicksburg, because they got to Vicksburg early, at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. They bought up all the land, and that was a big help.
Do you believe the story or agree with the story that at Vicksburg there was a Confederate, what they called in those days sharpshooters, today we would call them snipers, who had Grant in his sights and something prevented him from pulling the trigger?
You know why snipers are called snipers, by the way?
I don't know.
The snipe is the most difficult bird to shoot. Back in the old days of the market hunters, when this was in Europe, in England, we call them sharpshooters over here. What is it, the First World War, they were called snipers. But these guys were market hunters, and they didn't like to waste a lot of shots. But the sniper's a valuable market bird, and the other hunters would be sitting there at the market, having sold their whatever they shot, and they'd see this guy come by with a string of snipe, and they'd say, "There goes a sniper." That means he was a crack shot. That bird, that snipe will corkscrew and stuff. Interesting little sidelight.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting history which I have read about the development of the Kentucky rifle, or called the Pennsylvania rifle, and it was by Dutch and German immigrants to those parts of the country who were fundamentally responsible for the development of the long-range, highly accurate American rifle used in the 1800s.
Yeah, they were good metal workers.
Yes, yes. Davis's strategy, you might compare that. I mean, one might compare this with Hitler's. One might contrast it with Hitler's strategy in defending what the Germans called Festung Europa, which meant the European fortress. Davis felt you could not permit any inroads anywhere. You had to stop them at, quote, the water's edge, so to speak. Everywhere, whereas Hitler, they pulled back and they waited to see where the Allies come in and so on. But Davis's strategy was, well, it was an impossible strategy.
What's interesting about it is he was a military man. He was a West Point graduate. He'd been the Secretary of War, the U.S. Secretary of War, and he had always been on the committees in the Congress of military affairs, and so he should have probably known better than that. But on the other hand, he was suddenly forced to be a politician because his big interest, and he knew the difficulties he faced. His greatest task, as he saw it, was to bring England and France into this conflict. And it was his mindset that in order to be a nation, you had to be able to defend your territory, all of it. That if you would have these big Union armies coming down deep into your territory, these European countries, you're going to say, well, these people can't control it. They're not a nation. They're just a bunch of rebels. And so that was his theory, and he operated on it until it was too late.
There were Southerners, as I understand it, who said, apropos of a differing theory, I guess, that the North can never conquer the South because the amount of territory to be conquered is equivalent to Europe, in the Atlantic Ocean, to the Ural Mountains in Russia. Whoa, that's a lot of territory to have to conquer.
Oh, it certainly was.
Why did Halleck relieve Grant of command the first time and came close to arresting him, and in fact got a letter from McClellan saying, "You are authorized to arrest Grant"?
Well, I mean, nobody knows exactly, but I think all the reading that I've done, I think Halleck was jealous. The first time was after Fort Donelson, And Halleck had been sending messages demanding to know things like, what is the status of your troops, and how many, what's your morning report look like, these kind of things. And he got no response from Grant. And he became angry, and he'd heard rumors that Grant had gone to drinking again. And so he wrote McClellan complaining, but I think it had to do with Grant got all the credit for taking Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and Halleck is sitting back in Illinois riding a desk, and he didn't get any credit. And so he took Grant out of the picture temporarily and gave the Army to C.F. Smith. And then he restored Grant. Actually, that Lincoln was the guy who restored Grant, because all these rumors ultimately came to Lincoln. And Lincoln essentially told Halleck at that point, he told some of his cabinet, he said, "I can't spare that man, he fights," talking about Grant. And he told Halleck to put up a shut up. If you've got a charge you want to make against General Grant, make it. If you don't, restore him. And he did, in fact, restore him to command.
Didn't Halleck send James McPherson, same name as the current great author of the Civil War? Halleck sent him to spy on Grant, and later Lincoln sent an editor who would become a major figure in the Defense Department. They called it, I don't know what they called it then. Today we'd call it the Defense Department. Named Dana, Charles Dana.
Yeah, Charles Dana.
Yeah, to spy on Grant. And the irony was that both McPherson and Dana in turn became great followers of Grant and great aficionados of Grant.
Oh yeah, they were his closest advisors and extremely helpful to him.
Yeah, didn't McPherson? Don't you say that McPherson actually suggested and drew up the plans for the attacks on Forts Henry and Forts Donelson and Fort Henry?
Yeah, and I think he did. I mean, he was an engineer. That's who Grant would have consulted. As a matter of fact, I think it was that McPherson was actually the one who put the bug in Grant's ear. We need to move south on these river highways. But it's a sign of a good commander that listened to his subordinates. McPherson was unfortunately killed. He was the highest-ranking Union officer killed in the war. He was killed in the Battle of Atlanta. But there was an interesting story that Grant said to Sherman at one point. He said, "I think McPherson can go all the way," meaning he will be ultimately the commander of the Union Army. And Sherman said, "That's true, if he lives."
That is an amazing story. I mean, do you think that Sherman somehow had a premonition? Or was it the way McPherson went to the front in battle? Or
it's hard to tell. I mean, any of these guys who were in the lower command were exposing themselves to being killed every time they had a fight. And unless you were the 3- to 4-star general, you had to be out close to the fighting. It must have been a premonition, or it may have been just an offhand remark. But he said it.
By the way, wasn't Grant hit in the scabbard by a bullet at Shiloh?
Yeah, they said that it knocked his saber up in the air out of the scabbard, and all he had left was a scabbard. Nobody ever found the saber. But he was right in the thick of it. Grant was. I mean, especially in that battle, because you could come around a bend and all of a sudden you have a regiment of Confederates standing there because of the way the trees and the cover was.
What did Shiloh, in your opinion, teach the North or the South about military tactics, or maybe a better way to put it is, what should they have learned but failed to learn?
That's a good on the one level, it taught the North not to leave themselves unprotected and undefended, and it taught the South not to be late. I think what happened at Shiloh that almost cost the North the victory was that Sherman, and complicitly Grant, and McPherson, who was the engineer, had not fortified their position. I mean, here you had an army of, what, 40,000 men. You had a river on one side, you had a swamp on the other side, and you had an opening to an entire army of 40,000 Confederates, or 45,000 Confederates, only 18 miles to your north from your forwardmost positions. And I mean, some of the Union officers realized this, but Sherman, I think, was still suffering from his accusation that he was a scaredy cat, and that he was crazy, and that Sherman was determined he was going to prove he was brave, and he was not going to fortify. So back then, one theory was that the fortifications were not useful and not helpful to an offensive army, to an army on the attack. It created a certain fear in men that they wouldn't come out from behind the fortifications and fight. And that was not dispelled until really later on in the war in 1864, 1863, 1864. But Sherman had left that army, Sherman and Grant left it completely exposed. I mean, I can't imagine. It was like out of Macbeth. An entire rebel army of 45,000 men sneaked up on the Union Army. They got within 2 miles of them before they realized they were there. So certainly, Grant was never surprised again.
They didn't send out cavalry to scout.
No.
Today we would use airplanes. In the Second World War, you might use airplanes and tanks. They didn't send out cavalry to scout. They didn't send out pickets. And they seem to have, and this is the amazing thing to me, well, it's all amazing to me, they didn't seem to have any conception that instead of waiting for them at Corinth, which, as you say, was only 18 miles away, the Confederates might come marching down the road to, as they say, steal a march and attack them unexpectedly.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the Confederates had not demonstrated in the West at that point that they were willing to fight. You got to go back and remember they had evacuated that Fort Columbus, right south of Cairo, without a fight. They had abandoned Fort Henry almost without a fight, and they fought at Fort Donelson, but then they surrendered quickly, and they moved their whole line back. And so I think that Grant, Sherman, and the rest of those officers were thinking, you know, we're not really going to get a fight out of these guys. They're going to do it, simply retreat. And certainly they didn't expect to be attacked.
That's all a very, very good description, I think, of the reasons why a lot of people in the Army of the Potomac, when Grant went east, said he's never faced Bobby Lee before. Because, you know, Robert E. Lee was a horse of a whole different color in terms of aggression and audacity and willing to sacrifice life for gain and, you know, what he hoped would be gain and so on and so forth. Okay, in any event, I can't remember, Winston, any similar case except the Battle of the Bulge, where Americans completely ignored signs that the enemy was about to attack. Because, you know, as you say, Sherman, guys would come in and say they'd seen cavalry, they'd seen pickets, they'd seen scouts. He'd say, you're scaredy cats. And at the Battle of the Bulge, they saw it, heard tanks, engines rumbling. The airplanes noticed that the roads, there was no snow on the road, which is a sign that there have been engines running over them and melting the snow. Those are the two great examples, I think, of in American history where they just ignored things.
That's a very good example and an interesting comparison. But see, at Shiloh, they were instructed by Halleck and then by Grant in turn and by the other officers, do not bring on a battle until everybody there. At Shiloh, they were waiting for General Buell, who was marching from Nashville, toward Nashville. He was coming from Kentucky with another army of 22,000, 24,000 men. And they wanted, then they could combine these armies and they would have like 70,000 men and would be invulnerable to anything that Confederates could throw at them. And so they were instructed, don't bring on a battle. They didn't realize the Confederates had received no such instructions. And but the people like Sherman had instilled in their subordinates this notion of don't bring on a battle so thoroughly that they were frightened to bring on a battle because they would get in trouble. And so they ignored, they deluded themselves, essentially. They would send out until the very end. Sherman said, well, all that's out there is a regiment of Confederates and some artillery. Turned out it was the whole Confederate army. They had them that much fooled.
You know, that too has a comparison. That's very much like what Lee told Harry Heath and others before Gettysburg. Do not get involved in a big battle. You want to go get shoes, okay, but don't get involved in a battle. Next thing Lee knows, it's the Battle of Gettysburg, you know.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done, absolutely. Now, initially in the battle, because of the surprise, I gather the Confederates were just sweeping all before them.
Oh, they were. They were sweeping all through the Union encampments. They had these, I guess you'd call them divisions there, consisting of about 10,000, 12,000 men apiece. And they had, you know, all their tents. They had, if you think about it, in a 12 square mile area, they had 5,000 of these enormous 8-man, 10-man tents, white tents that stuck up in the air, like little conical things. And the Confederates, in most cases, swept right through these in the beginning because they had total surprise, or almost total surprise. And then the Confederates, because it had taken them 2 or 3 days to march from Corinth down to the battlefield at Shiloh, they had eaten up their rations and they were hungry. And it was time for breakfast. And they couldn't cook their breakfast before the battle because the Union people would see the smoke and smell the bacon frying. And so they stopped and ate breakfast at the Union tents. They caught the Union soldiers at breakfast, and that was not good for the assault.
It's because that just enabled the Union to pull back a little bit and, you know, form more lines and whatever. Meanwhile, the Union soldiers, and Grant saw this when he came up, as did Buell the next day or that night when he finally arrived with his soldiers. These guys had gone down some kind of big bluff, and they were congregating by the river underneath the bluff, where frankly they would have been sitting ducks if the Confederates had ever gotten to the edge of the bluff.
Oh yeah, and I mean, what happened was it was almost like the bull in its cart. When you put a bull in the ring, he tries to get out of the ring the same way he came in. And the Union troops, when they were overrun, they were terrified. I mean, both sides had never fought a battle. Some of the Union troops had never even, some of them didn't have weapons. Some of them didn't have ammunition for their weapons. They never shot their weapons. And suddenly they were rushed at by these people with murder in their eyes. And it terrified them, and they ran. You can't really blame them. They were completely green troops, had not been trained. They came right from the recruiting station. And they ran back to where they came from, to the steamboat landing, and got into the protection of the bluff because there was so much artillery flying around. I mean, big iron balls every which way. And they were hitting trees and knocking the limbs down. A limb would kill you. And it was said, I think that Buell counted, he said 15,000 deserters under that bluff. I don't know if that's quite accurate, but it's probably around there, 10 to 15,000, which would be a third of Grant's army ran away.
Those days, and in that army, an awful lot of the young men were 18, 19 kids.
That'd be 18 was probably the average age, 18, 19, the average age of the privates.
Wow, that's you're dealing with kids. I guess the most famous, you know, if you could say that the Battle of Shiloh consisted of many individual battles, the most famous one of them would be the Hornets Nest, which strikes me as very similar. At Antietam, it was the sunken road, where people just got mowed down in droves. And here it was the Hornets Nest, and both of them were like farm roads. Anyway, the Hornet. Why don't you describe the battle at the Hornets Nest just a little bit?
Well, the Hornets Nest was really, the sunken road was more or less part of the Hornets Nest. It was an old wagon road, and it wasn't really terribly deeply sunken like the road there at Antietam, but it provided some fortification for the Union regiments. It was General Prentice's division, And Prentiss was really, he wasn't most of these generals were militia generals. They were not West Point trained generals in the Union Army, such as Grant and Sherman. They were, from their state militias, and a lot of that was politics. But Grant had told Prentiss to hold his line at all hazards, is the way they described it. All hazards, meaning to death. And Prentiss took him at his word. And the result was that he got himself surrounded and captured a whole division, of what was left of it. But he stood and he fought all afternoon, all morning and all afternoon, in that what they call the Hornets Nest, which was, caused because there were so many bullets going back and forth. It was like the Hornets, because the bullets would make a zinging sound in the air.
6 hours, I think you said, that battle lasted, and ultimately the Confederates overran it only by having three other major figures, Breckinridge, and was it Johnston, and I forgot who they all were, lead a charge.
Yeah, General Johnston, he was having trouble with a Tennessee regiment. Somebody came back and said this regiment doesn't want to fight. It was one of Breckinridge's regiments. And so Breckinridge went down there. Breckinridge had been, oddly enough, the vice president of the United States, and he was a Confederate general. He went down there to see what he could do, and he discovered it wasn't just a regiment, it was a whole brigade by that time that didn't want to fight, because they thought they were being sacrificed, and he kept charging this Hornets Nest, and they would lose, 100 men, and then because the soldiers would only go as far, they knew when to quit. I mean, they knew when people were falling all around them, they weren't going to stand there and just, they weren't suicidal. In any case, Johnston went down there, and he talked to the men. He rode on his horse up and down the line, and he said, "Men, will you follow me? I'll lead this charge." And Breckinridge said the same thing to his men, and so they did indeed. Johnston led that charge out there, and he got them going, got them moving, and then either as he was coming back or when he was turned around, whatever, he was talking to someone, one of his aides, I think, and he said, "General, you all right?" And he said, "I'm fine." And a moment later, he began to sort of topple in his saddle. And then he'd lost consciousness, and the aide was on his horse, somehow held on to horse and him and got him back out of the line of battle and down from the saddle. And they kept trying to find out what was wrong with it. They couldn't find any bullet holes. They found some holes through his clothing. But what was happening at that point was he had been shot behind the knee, of all places, into that artery, that major artery, and he was bleeding to death in his boot. And they couldn't tell it until it was too late. And it only took him about 15 minutes to die.
I think you said in the book that Johnston had been hit in something called the popliteal artery.
If he'd had his surgeon there, and he had a personal surgeon, he would have lived, because the surgeon would have immediately known to tourniquet, tie a tourniquet, and stop that flow of blood. But he had sent the surgeon off to tend some wounded Yankee prisoners, all ironic things. And so one of the aides was the governor of Tennessee, Isham Harris. And he didn't know what to do. And suddenly the commanding general of the Confederate Army is dead. And the command devolved on General Beauregard.
For a long time, Beauregard was accused of throwing away the victory because in the evening, after Johnston's death and Beauregard had assumed command, he did not send forces on Beauregard's far right, that would have been the far Union left, right next to the river, because the point would have been to cut off the Union Army from Pittsburgh Landing and the steamboats and drive it back into a bunch of swamp. But you're of the impression, I gather, that even had Beauregard attempted this, it would have failed because of the situation that had arisen by the time of the early evening.
The situation was this: by the evening, and by that I mean it was getting to be twilight. The Union Army had been pushed back about as far as it could go without going into the river or the swamps. General Buell had arrived on the other side of the river, and of course, if the Confederates could have taken the landing, they'd have prevented him from landing, and simply had Grant to deal with. But by the time all of that occurred, what was left of the Union Army had drawn itself up like a rattlesnake. They had a number of big siege guns, which these guns were taller than a man. I mean, they weren't the regular 12-pound Napoleon cannons. They had been designed to lay siege to Corinth, and they had big, the balls on them were about like this, big exploding balls. And so they loaded these things with what amounted to buckshot, grape shot and canister shot, so that they were like a giant shotgun, and they had this just almost hub-to-hub line of artillery that Sherman and some of these other Union commanders had organized, Grant. By that time, those guys who were manning that line, they proved they weren't going to run away. This was the best that the Union Army had left. They did have 10,000 or maybe 15,000 stragglers or deserters down below the bluff, but these guys were going to fight it out. And the Confederates made 2 charges. They were both unsuccessful. It was just about dark. Beauregard, part of Beauregard's problem was that he was 2 miles away from this action. He was at Shiloh Church, which is the battlefield is named for, a little Methodist chapel called Shiloh, which in Hebrew means place of peace of all things. But Beauregard remained back there instead of moving up. He was ill. He'd had an operation on his throat, which in those days was a very serious thing. And so they said he had a high temperature, he wasn't feeling well, so you can forgive for that. But he thought, look, we got Grant cornered, look what we've done today. We pushed the whole army, Union Army back, we did all so on, captured a whole division. We can finish him off in the morning. I'm going to order the Confederate Army to pull back to the old Union encampments. And he did, and of course this infuriated General Bragg, General Breckinridge, who were there, because they thought one more push would do it. My personal opinion is, I walked over and looked at it, that'd be an awful tough nut to crack. If they had had another couple of divisions there, maybe it would have been possible. But with the men they had on hand, which I'm making a guess, they had probably 5,000-6,000 at that point, counting casualties. I don't know if they could have taken that position. It's conceivable they'd taken everything else that day. But I think that those people who blame Beauregard, saying that he cost us a civil war and all that, that's a bunch of BS. I mean, this guy, he was fighting as hard as he knew how to fight. He just thought that he could win it the next day. But the interesting thing is that evening, Nathan Bedford Forrest, whose name appears much later in the Civil War, he was a colonel, and he had the cavalry, and he sent a bunch of his people. He collected uniforms from dead Union soldiers, and he dressed his soldiers in the uniforms of the dead Yankees, and they went down to the river, and they saw Buell coming across that evening. And he went back and tried to report it, and he couldn't find anybody to try to report to. There was a huge rainstorm, number one. And you have to understand that Shiloh is such a dense, dark place anyway, with the woods and everything. But he found a couple of generals. I think he told General Hardee, who was a corps commander of the Confederates, that Buell was crossing, and if you don't stop him now, we're going to lose in the morning. And Hardee just said, you go tell Beauregard. Well, he couldn't find Beauregard. And as a result, they woke up in the morning, Buell was there.
Winston, thank you very much. Great book.
It's been a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, and thank you very much.
I wish I'd had time to come up there to Boston. I like Boston.
Great. To the audience, thank you for being with us, and be with us again next time.